that World War I was a war without winners. We left off with the Paris Peace Conference in 1919 and the influence of American President Woodrow Wilson at this conference. So in a way, this kind of encapsulates the view that there weren't winners of World War I, because the real power at this stage is the United States. It's not in the hands of Europe. Wilson, of course, as we talked about, wanted to create a general association of nations to guarantee political independence and territorial integrity. And this body became the League of Nations. Another principle, very important principle of Wilson's, was national self-determination. And this meant redrawing the boundaries of Europe to make nationalities, in theory, the basis for the new order. In other words, all national groups were to have the right to their own state and to the governance of their own affairs. And Wilson argued that constructing nations along national or ethnic lines would help eliminate sort of conflicts and tensions that he felt had led to World War I. Of course, it doesn't work out that way, and the populations of Europe couldn't be so easily divided. Czechoslovakia, Poland, for instance, both contained large minorities, German minorities, Hungarian groups of Hungarians. So really, with the construction of new states, you didn't have it along clearly defined national lines. The deciding powers at the peace conference, above all the US, but also Britain and France. But the peace conference really wasn't a peaceful process. There were quarrels based on national interest. Wilson, of course, with his League of Nations and national self-determination. Britain and France wanted reparations from Germany. And French, of course, the French worried about their own national security. The conference did end in compromise. The League of Nations was established. A defensive alliance was also made between the US, Britain, and France, sort of versus Germany, to help ease French concerns. In the end, the peace treaty was actually a series of treaties conducted with the defeated nations of Austria, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Turkey. They were all hurried, and with the new borders that had been withdrawn, you had quite significant numbers of population transfers. The best known treaty, of course, was the Treaty of Versailles, and that was handed to the Germans in June 1919. You may have already heard that the Treaty of Versailles was very, very harsh, that it was a harsh peace. But that's not really the case. Certainly the Treaty of Versailles was actually quite mild in comparison with what the Germans had inflicted on the Russians in March 1918 with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. But it clashed with German perceptions of the war, of the German perception that they'd won the war in the East, and the disbelief that they felt in November 1918 with the idea that Germany had actually lost the war. However, when you think about the nature of the Treaty of Versailles, I'll go over some very broad details. This is where your textbook, Merriman, will come in handy. But Germany wasn't occupied, and that in itself is quite mild at the end of a war. It did lose about 10% of its territory, but much of this territory was actually recent acquisitions. Alsace-Lorraine, for instance. Germany lost their colonies, but also this was recent acquisitions. They were recent acquisitions. And they weren't entirely profitable, as we learned in the imperialism lecture. Their army was limited to 100,000 men, their navy was destroyed, and the air force was banned. The independent state of Poland was established with a so-called Polish corridor, which was actually to give Poland access to the sea. And this made the German city of Danzig an international city. There was huge propaganda in Germany against the treaty because it supposedly blamed Germans for the war. Of course, Article 231 was called the so-called War Guilt Clause. It wasn't, however, the War Guilt Clause. The opening segment of Article 231 was actually on reparations. And it was the same clause in other treaties. But the idea for Germany that they were being blamed for the war was really useful to mobilize resentment against the Treaty of Versailles. And we'll talk about that a little bit when we talk about the rise of Nazism in Germany. So the idea of Article 239 was that it provided sort of a sense of scapegoating. When you think about the reparations that Germany was to pay, these were constantly renegotiated throughout the 1920s, and Germany actually ended up paying very little of the reparations. They stopped paying altogether in early 1930. Today, I want to backtrack a little bit because we're going to talk about the Russian Revolution and Civil War in from 1917 to 1921. And World War I was a particular catalyst for major change in Russia. It opened a period of possibility, a period of uncertainty, but above all, what turned out to be a period of terror. We know, of course, that Russia was not the only belligerent that actually experienced that kind of complete collapse, or that experienced collapse in 1917. But it was one where the society was sort of rebuilt from the start, something that others were predicting might happen throughout Europe. It only happened in Russia. Out of this collapse came the Russian Revolution, an event that would, of course, have a massive impact on Europe and actually the world for decades to come. One of the typical questions that historians ask about the revolution was whether World War I was responsible for it. The answer is that the First World War was a catalyst. Russia didn't handle the war well. The Tsar was absent through much of the war. His wife, the Tsarina Alexandra, appeared to be governing. But there were also long-term rifts tied to social reform in Russia, major rifts in society between the haves and the have-not. So I'm going to start out by providing a bit of Russian context to the revolution. Russia, by 1900, had become the fourth largest industrialized nation in Europe. But with industrialization comes social problems. Certainly factories, but also an industrial working class, and the sort of pitiful working conditions and living conditions that accompanied industrialization everywhere in Europe. But it comes late to Russia. In conjunction with industrialization and the emergence of this large working class, soon came socialism. In Russia, however, socialist movements were the target of state repression, very, very severe state repression. And this forced the socialist movements underground and inspired them to actually become revolutionary movements. The goal of various socialist revolutionary organizations that sprang up in Russia was the complete overthrow of the Tsarist regime. This idea of establishing peasant socialism, because of the harsh repression they faced, these parties, or you can't even really call them parties, these movements had no public or participatory outlet for their opposition to the Tsarist regime. So instead, they eventually come to, advocate political terrorism and the assassination of government officials and members of the ruling dynasty. Now, the revolution that finally brought an end to the ruling Romanov dynasty in 1917 was not the first revolution that Tsar Nicholas II faced. In 1905, after the disastrous loss of the war against Japan, mixed with growing social unrest in Russia, There was a widespread revolt. The Tsar's response was to massacre protesters in St. Petersburg on January 5th, an event that's known as Bloody Sunday. However, to prevent all-out revolution in 1905, Tsar Nicholas was actually forced to offer some concessions. These concessions included civil liberties, the creation of a parliament called the Duma. Soon, however, this sort of progress ended. The Tsar reneged on many of his reforms. He curtailed the power of the Duma, and he retrenched his own power. So by 1914, by the dawn of the World War, or the Great War, Tsar Nicholas had to rely very much on his army and state bureaucracy to uphold his regime. So he was already the target of much opposition and much hatred. In Russia, like elsewhere in Europe, World War I simply magnified Russia's problems and severely challenged the government. So the focus of discontent was the Tsar, in particular as Russia faced ongoing and massive defeat. Some historians actually argue that Russia was on the brink of revolution already in 1914, and that the war sort of provided a little bit of a respite with an injection of wartime patriotism. So in other words, patriotic feelings that arose during the war covered over social problems, but only for a time being. If we have some time, I will show you a film clip from a depiction of the Russian Revolution, and it's based on Boris Pasternak's novel, and the name escapes me. Dr. Zhivago. Okay, thank you. Dr. Zhivago. So if we have time, we'll take a look at that. One of the interesting things and important elements about Nicholas II was that he was the only European monarch to take complete control or personal charge of the armed forces, despite lacking the training to do so. This is a huge responsibility, of course. So the Tsar's fate is tied to the fate of the war. Russian industry, of course, was unable to produce the weapons that the Russian army needed. It led to incredible losses. We talked about last week how Russians sort of were woefully under-equipped. So the Russian army basically just threw men against German steel. Between 1914 and 1916, 2 million Russian soldiers had been killed, while another 4 to 6 million were wounded or were captured for POWs. So put simply, the Tsarist regime was completely unprepared for the tasks that it faced in 1914. The enthusiasm that greeted the outbreak of the war was soon dispersed, and the government began to distrust its own people. Despite all the turmoil in his nation, however, Nicholas was increasingly insulated from it by his wife, Alexandra. And Alexandra was hated throughout most of Russia. And she began to take on an incredibly prominent role in state affairs. She was accused of being a German spy. That's not the case, but again, it was sort of the perception and the propaganda that mattered at this stage. She was under the influence of a figure you probably have heard of, Rasputin, a Siberian peasant, whom she regarded as a holy man because he seemed to be, or he appeared to be, the only one who was able to stop the bleeding of her hemophilic son, Alexei, who was heir to the Russian throne. He was named, or given the nickname, the Mad Monk, because he claimed to have psychic and healing powers. And he advocated sexual and alcohol-induced orgies somehow as a way of sort of ultimately, I guess, escaping sin and vice. His influence, his growing influence over Alexander, made him somewhat, well actually more than somewhat of a power behind the throne, and he did not hesitate to interfere in state affairs, often with disastrous consequences. And it was actually Rasputin who advised the Tsar to take personal control of the army. So, while the Tsar and his top leadership faced military and economic disasters, the middle class, aristocrats, and peasants, soldiers, and even workers grew more and more disenchanted with the Tsar's regime and its ability to steer Russian victory. So you have dissatisfaction from the upper classes right through to the so-called lower classes. Even these conservative aristocrats who supported the monarchy felt the need to do something to sort of reverse the deteriorating situation in Russia before it was too late. So what did they do? For a start, a group of nobles assassinated Rasputin in December 1916. Turns out he's not an easy guy to kill. He was given a glass of wine filled with a poison. Didn't appear to have an effect. He was repeatedly shot, but did not die. And eventually, they smashed in his skull and drowned him. That did it. He did pass away at that stage, but it actually led to the fact behind his death led to more of this kind of mythical creation of Rasputin. There were, in fact, 2 revolutions in Russia in 1917. And I'm going to talk about the dates that refer to the old Russian calendar, which is 13 days behind the Western calendar. Merriman does the same thing. So if you've read other dates that I'm going to highlight, it's only the difference in calendars. Some historians use the Western, some use the Russian. Russia is a cauldron of tensions, particularly in St. Petersburg or Petrograd. So the first revolution takes place in this capital city in February 1917, and it's due to anger over hunger, deprivations, and the Tsar's ongoing unwillingness to reform. A series of strikes broke out in January and February. I can't hook my Mac up here, so unfortunately our pictures have to be printed versions for the time being. The series of strikes in January and February, a particularly important one was the munitions workers at the Kudylov factory. That's 30,000 workers walking out who are working in war industry. February 23rd is a particularly important day because here it's the actions of working class women that actually changed the course of Russian history. Prior to the strikes, the government had introduced severe bread rationing in Petrograd, and the state had instituted a monopoly over the grain in order to supply the army for the war. So the result was that people had to line up for hours and hours to get their bread, to feed their hungry families. And many of these women who stood in line weren't housewives, they were also factory workers, so they'd been working a 12-hour day and then had hours of waiting in line in the cold to get bread for their families. And these women, the Russian government soon noticed, were proving to be an extremely volatile presence in the capital. If you listen to one police report on the situation, it reads, "Mothers of families exhausted by endless standing in line at stores, distraught over their half-starving and sick children, are today perhaps closer to revolution than the liberal opposition leaders. And of course, they are a great deal more dangerous because they are the combustible material of which only a single spark is needed to burst into flame." So on February 23rd, a day that's celebrated as International Women's Day, about 10,000 Petrograd women begin to march through the streets of the city, shouting slogans like "peace and bread" and "down with the monarchy." Some women are joined soon by other workers, and together they call for a general strike. So they want to shut down all of the factories in the city, and this general strike takes place on February 25th. The Tsarina, Alexandra, who was watching over things in the capital while the Tsar was on the battlefield, assured her husband that the unrest was nothing to worry about. "This is a hooligan movement," she wrote. If the weather were very cold, they would all probably stay at home. Nonetheless, Nicholas ordered his troops to disperse the crowds and to shoot if necessary. So again, his response is to order sort of unquestioning repression. Initially, the troops begin to cooperate, but then something important happens. Significant numbers of soldiers sympathize with the protesters, and instead of shooting the crowds, they begin to join the demonstrators. So the situation is rapidly escalating beyond the Tsar's control, and his regime at this point, in hindsight, is fatally stricken. On February 26th, a right-wing liberal in the Tsar's government writes to him, and he says, quote, "The situation is growing worse. Measures must be adopted immediately because tomorrow will be too late. The last hour has come when the fate of the fatherland and the dynasty is being decided." Nicholas's response was to again not take anything terribly seriously. He wrote, quote, "This fat Radzianko has written me some nonsense to which I will not even reply." So the miserable conditions of the war, the lack of food, the sympathy with the protesters, the empathy with the demands of the workers for bread and for peace, result in a massive defection of soldiers. Sailors in the Baltic Fleet also mutiny. But despite the fact that by this stage insurgents basically control his capital city, the Tsar is away at his resort on the sea. So basically, what's happening is a series of events and that are sort of falling like dominoes, because next, the Duma, the parliament, which the Tsar had actually tried to dissolve to entrench his power again, they meet anyway. And they declare that they're now taking charge of the government. The Duma elects a provisional committee, so an executive in charge of national affairs. And the mandate of this committee is to restore order. Because, of course, members of the Duma, they're liberals, and they have a desire for reform, but they also have a fear of what's happening in the capital city. They have a fear of the masses and the protests that are taking place. So it's kind of a paradoxical situation, because they actually now need to contain the revolution that they've helped to start. March 1st, Tsar Nicholas heads to Petrograd, but he's derailed. And he's forced to abdicate. And for those of you who read Russian, this is the flyer announcing the Tsar's abdication. He does on March 2nd, 1917, and he leaves the throne to his brother. But his brother refuses it. So the question is, what will take the place now of the Romanov dynasty? Different groups are trying to influence and move events forward. Liberals only wanted reform, but you also have the socialist revolutionaries, as well as Menshevik and Bolshevik activists. We'll talk about those a little bit later in the lecture. But the socialist revolutionaries, the goal was the overthrow of the Tsarist regime and complete revolution. So these groups don't really agree on where Russia should head next, on how Russia should be steered. Nevertheless, the Provisional Committee begins to function as a provisional government. And at this stage, it's made up mostly of liberals. Their agenda was parliamentary democracy and reforms, such as universal suffrage, an 8-hour workday. So this is hardly hardcore leftist revolution. But the provisional government has to contend with a new source of authority, and this is the Soviets, or literally the councils of the workers. So you have this awkward position of the provisional government and the Petrograd Soviet, who are now sort of serving as dual or parallel governments to Russia. Alexander Kerensky is a lawyer, and he's the leader of the Socialist Revolutionaries, a member of the Soviet. He also becomes a minister in the provincial government, and he tries to sort of smooth relations between the two, between the provisional government, not provincial, provisional government and the Soviets. So the Soviets had agreed at this stage to accept the authority of the provisional government to continue the war and to maintain order. But these Soviet groups that had sprung up in the first months of 1917, they do represent the more radical interests of the lower classes. And among these was the Marxist Social Democratic Party, which had first formed in 1898, but had divided in 1903 into two factions known as the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks. The Mensheviks wanted to create a mass electoral socialist party based on a Western model, sort of like the Social Democrats in Germany. We'll talk about that when we talk about the interwar years. But in other words, it means they were willing to cooperate, at least temporarily, in a parliamentary democracy, although they were still working towards the goal, the ultimate goal of a socialist state in Russia. The Bolsheviks were a small faction, very small faction, of Russian Social Democrats, and they weren't an especially important force at the start of the revolution because many are in exile abroad, including their leader, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. Now, Lenin did not begin his career as a revolutionary. He was actually a lawyer. But one of the defining moments in his life was the arrest of his brother, who was executed eventually for participating in an assassination attempt on Tsar Alexander III. So this turns Lenin into a dedicated enemy of Tsarist Russia. He moves to St. Petersburg in 1894, where he helps to organize an illegal group known as the Union for the Liberation of the Working Class. Don't worry too much. There's a lot of the detail I'm providing is also in Merriman. So I just want to get you to have a sense of how these events sort of move forward. But don't worry about the detail. Soon, however, Lenin's arrested for this activity, and he's shipped to Siberia, and he goes into exile in Switzerland from there. So it's largely from abroad that he assumes the leadership of the Bolshevik wing of the Russian Social Democratic Party. And so it's under Lenin's direction that the Bolsheviks become dedicated to violent revolution in Russia, to destroy the capitalist system. The outbreak of war in 1914 gave Lenin hope that all of Europe was actually ripe for revolution. When the revolution in February 1917 leads to the formation of the provisional government in Russia, Lenin believed that the time had come to strike. So a few weeks later, with the help of the German High Command, who helps actually bring Lenin back to Russia, hoping that they can create disorder in Russia and sort of provoke Russia to leave the war,